are there first. They're the fastest swims. They are the ones that see an opportunity to make a quick profit. It takes time for an innovation to become generally accepted and for regulators to get their heads around it and weed out those sharks to make sure that there's no unscrupulous operators. So that's at first selection. You attract the wrong crowd in the beginning. It also causes moral hazard. People that engage in financial innovation are not always bearing the consequences of that financial innovation. Not all financial innovation is good. If it goes wrong, then the originators usually say, well, sorry, we just thought we were doing the right thing, we obviously didn't. Too bad, you can't expect us to make good for any losses. So maybe that has a bearing on that quote that I've got here from a research paper about what caused the financial crisis in Australia, speculation in real estate, unscrupulous operators in financial institutions, and lastly, financial innovation. So financial innovation can be bad, is what that quote suggests. Important people, really important academics, have an opinion about this. So fairly recently there was a story, as you can see, September 2012 in The Economist, about financial innovation leading to growth and prosperity. I'm probably in the camp that believes that we get economic growth through financial innovation. So I would reside a bit more with Ross. Ross says that in the long run, financial innovation is imperative. Without financial innovation, we're stagnant. And there won't be any economic growth, we just accept the status quo. So at the very least, we need to have that to improve welfare, wealth, prosperity. Stiglitz says that forget about it, all that you finance people do, he doesn't really like us, finance people. All you people do is come up with the wrong innovations, self-centered, self-interested innovations that don't contribute to economic growth at all. Maybe we are a bit in the middle there. So the three case studies I'm going to look at are microfinance. I'm spending most time on that, so don't get alarmed if that goes a little bit over time. I'm spending a little bit of time on social banking and low lending. This should probably be a recap for most of you. You're probably more familiar with microfinance than our Australian students are. Although I have to say that 2 years ago, a group of students, of our students, set up a new student society. We have a lot of those. But set up a microfinance initiative student society. And I think it's now got something like 300 members. It is a very popular student society. They're engaging with microfinance institutions, so they don't provide the finance, but they're engaging with microfinance institutions, learn how they provide the loan, and maybe help out in advising the people who get the loans into making most productive use of those loans. So a small team, for example, has gone through to Cambodia to look at what is actually happening in some of the villages where these loans are being provided. So what microfinance is about is provide financial services to the unbanked and the underbanked, people that don't have access to traditional finance at all. The loans are very small. The example I'll give you in a moment is just about $150 on average, so they're really small. There's no collateral. Now that's a problem. Hardly anyone wants to give you a collateral exempt loan, unless there's some kind of government guarantee. So how do they get around? Well, they get around, one way to get around there is to come up with joint liability. Create social peer pressure. So within the village, everyone is responsible for the sum total of loans. That's a pretty powerful incentive. For that reason, perhaps, the repayment rates are actually quite good. They're not perfect, but 95% is pretty good for the sector that traditional banking doesn't want to touch. There is, of course, the money lenders are there, right? So before microfinance, most people seem to have forgotten about this, but before microfinance, there was something called a money lender. Not a very popular figure in terms of public perception. Typically putting on what we call usurious interest rates, 30%, 40%, even higher. They could basically charge anything because they were monopolists in the lending market. So no one really knows what happened with that profession. So I'm being naughty here, but have they become microfinance providers? They relabeled themselves? No, I don't think so either. But they're not gone either, so they're still there, and there's still these kinds of loans as well. We need to keep an eye on what actually is happening there. So examples here, they go from NGOs all the way through commercial banks. And investment funds, in fact, are very active in the microfinance market. A staggering, I think it's now well over 100 million clients worldwide. That's unbelievable. So it does seem to have a certain impact in terms of reaching out to a lot of people. There's also a lot of microfinance institutions, some of them not particularly efficient, although you can argue that you need a particular small scale to be effective in this market. Most are small, most have just got a client base of a few thousand, a village or a few villages. But it's not all good news. It was good news when the founder of the Grameen Bank, Mohamed Yunus, got the Nobel Peace Prize. Not in economics, peace. Then it was good news. This is a real effort to get people out of poverty. We would call that banking with a conscience. Banking with a moral objective. So we start from what we call in ethics, Aristotelian ethics, also known as virtue ethics. To do good, to feel good about your profession, you need to take virtual business decisions. Lifting the poor out of poverty clearly fits there. So what's gone wrong? Microfinance comes under intense scrutiny. What this little story suggests is that in India, people became so over-indebted that some of them committed suicide. The levels of interest rates were so exorbitant that it was hard to distinguish them from the moneylenders from the past. So something changed in terms of the good impression that the public would have had of one of these initiatives. So microfinance clearly is an innovation. It looks simple, right? Really give really small loans to people in destitution that desperately need the money and can turn that into productive use. That's a really simple operational transaction. Yet, for getting such a wide reach, something had to change, an innovation. SKS, I'll flick through these slides. Have you heard of SKS? It's one of the largest microfinance providers. Originally government-owned, but increasingly becoming a limited enterprise and growing very rapidly. It's got all the hallmarks of doing the right thing. Currently they have 2,500 branches, reaching 7.7 million people, of which the vast majority are women. So many social objectives that are good, that are productive, lifting poor out of poverty. SKS seems to be on the right track. Unfortunately, last year or so it all went wrong with SKS, and it attracted nothing but bad press. To the point that the CEO was fired, the board got sacked, the whole governance structure fell apart of SKS. Now why is that? Why did it attract so much scrutiny? Not just SKS, even the Grameen Bank, the originator of this new product, microfinancing, also attracted some bad press of doing the wrong thing for the people it was supposed to be serving. So my take on it is that there's a couple of problems, but the biggest problem is what we would call unfettered growth, uncontrolled growth. 80% in a 3 to 5 year time span. The only way that that growth could be accommodated was by the entrance of new providers, mostly commercial banks, crowding out the NGOs. The NGOs were very much dependent on donations, on gifts. The commercial banks, of course, don't attract their funding through donations. They attract funding through borrowing or by attracting investment fund deposits. Different investors, therefore, that engaged in securitization included institutional investors and hedge funds. Now hang on, if you just donated money to an NGO because you also believe in the ethical purpose of the microfinance institution, now this microfinance institution is that we can no longer operate as an NGO, we need to expand our business, reach out to more people. We can only do that by attracting funds from people who are willing to bear the fairly high risk. Hedge funds, investment funds, jump to mind. Now, what are the objectives of these hedge funds? New investors, unlike you and me, who've got a moral objective. They would be profits first and foremost, a return on assets. So there's already a misalignment between objectives. We call that sometimes an agency conflict as well, agency problems. The people that are investing are in all likelihood having a different objective, business objective, than the microfinance institution that you work for that is providing those loans. So that causes a whole set of problems. Lack of outreach and education of investors is just one of the examples. Investments crowding out donations, that's what I just explained. Consider the rate setting. I'll show you some interest rates in a moment. 30% interest rates are not unusual in the microfinance sector. That's pretty high, it seems to me. Should there be some kind of a maximum interest rate, 17%? Well, that's really a choice between those three extremes, if you want. Usury, basically you charge whatever you want to charge. Philanthropy, that basically means that it comes out of your pockets and you're just helping the poor. Or should you leave it to market? Which one is it that is determining the most appropriate interest rates that should be charged? Lastly, I think that is an important thing. What happened in the past was that the NGOs were actually overcharging on the initial loans. They were surprised that the repayment rates were so good, which meant that the actual risk wasn't so bad. So what did they do with the returns, with the profits they were making? They're NGOs, non-profit. So they were immediately reinvesting them into new loans. So that's kind of nice because that closes the loop and it keeps recirculating the money. Now what happens if there's a hedge fund providing the investment funds? The profits that are made are not going to go back into the operation. The profits in all likelihood will go out to the original investors. So that is, if you want, a diversion of investment funds from a public objective to a private objective. Just a few graphs to show you how fast this market has been growing. Just look at the Philippines, reaching out about 750,000 people, and now this is 2008, it's now well over 2.5 million people that make use of microfinance. So there's a strong growth. The composition of those loans, it used to be mostly equity, the donations, if you want. Well, you can see that the equity is shrinking. More and more microfinance depend on loans, depend on investment deposits. That's changing the nature of the operation and might explain why it becomes harder and harder for these microfinance initiatives to stick with their ethical objectives. Overseas investors. It's sometimes alleged that overseas investors change the objective as well. If you attract more overseas investment, and just look at Cambodia, the bulk of microfinance funds comes from overseas investors. In Indonesia, it is about 25%, 75% is still being given, donated, or otherwise through Indonesian investors. So maybe that changes the objectives as well. The more arm's length the investors are, the less interested, the less concerned they would be with the population that these loans go to. Profit squeeze. People think that this is a really profitable business. And the newspaper stories about SKS seem to suggest that. The top graph tells you more or less what the typical interest rate is charged by either non-profit NGOs or by profit organizations. It's actually not that different. You might have thought that the non-profit were subsidizing the loans. Well, that's actually not the case. It seems that the market paradigm is most active here, and that more entrants into this market, there's so many more microfinance institutions now, have caused the rates to come down, which is good, of course, for the borrowers. It also means, though, the bottom half of the graph, that the return on asset has been what we call squeezed. So, if the marketplace becomes more competitive, you've got to drop your interest rates. And you see that the non-profit margin was actually higher than the profit margin, which is kind of interesting. but they're converging fairly rapidly to a low level. So a profit squeeze, what do? If you can't charge a higher price, how do you keep your revenue flowing? Increase the volume. Hence, what microfinance institutions start to do is start to pump the volume. Start to increase more or less aggressive tactics in getting many more people to take out these loans. So volume is a nice substitute for price that was caused by this profit squeeze. So what was the trick? I should have asked what the trick was. And then when I was just hitting the last few slides of these microfinance institutions, so the next few slides talk about governance and social responsibility. What is interesting, if you look at the charters of many of those microfinance institutions, very few actually tell you about the ethical objective. It's kind of assumed. We provide money to poor people, so surely that is ethically good. But the ways in which we achieve this, whether these methods are ethical, there's not a lot of discussion about it. So that's kind of interesting. I also had a graph there which tells you about the incentives for the SKS intermediaries, the people that go to the villages and that find the business. They get paid on a pro rata, and the pro rata is being driven by volume and quality of the portfolio. So what do? They get paid more. The bankers of those microfinance institutions get paid more if they bring more clients to the table, and if they focus on the ones that are most likely to repay, the higher quality. You hang on, then you almost become traditional bankers. So why focus so much on quality? If you look at the other incentives that are provided, that carry a lot less weight, that is outreach to poor people. Now that's all the wrong incentives. It is incentives that stray away from the ethical charter, more towards what traditional banks are doing. And we already know that traditional banks are not perceived as very ethical, very trustworthy by the public. So much for microfinance institutions. The next case study I'll talk about is peer-to-peer, or as I call it, social banking. Don't confuse it with what large established banks are doing. They also say that they now create P2P platforms. But P2P platforms is just a smart trick that on your iPhone you can do your banking online. Well, that's great. That's not really peer-to-peer. It means that you can pay, you and I can agree that, so I'll pay for your lunch and I'll just transfer you the money. That's peer-to-peer. No, that is not what I meant with P2P. What P2P is smart operators setting up this internet website, as I explained when I started this talk, and connecting people that need small amounts of money with people that are interested in playing a computer game. Ooh, it's not really like that, right? But some people perceive it like that. They perceive the bidding process, which is like eBay. Everyone familiar with eBay? So, good. Well, this is eBay for banking. So you can bid on it, and you can bid on parts of it. You can bid on part of a loan at a particular interest rate. We call that a Dutch auction. The one that gets awarded the loan is the one that comes in with the lowest interest rate, the cheapest provider. So some people call that democratization of finance. As far as I ignore the middleman. That's not quite true, because the moderator of the internet side is actually a financial intermediary and is actually taking a bit of profit out of the transaction. In fact, they're so sophisticated, and they're financial innovators, they are participating in the bidding process. Oh, that's tricky. If they become part of the bidders, then they've got their own interest to look after, rather than the interest of the investors. Remember that the investors were your family and friends? Are you putting yourself before your family and friends? That's an ethical dilemma. That's a problem in this particular area. What is interesting is that one of the biggest players after Prosper, that's a US-based player. SOPA is the second biggest in the world. Their non-performing loans on these small loans, and we're talking, it's bigger than microfinance, but it's like $500, $1,000 loans, so they're still small loans. There's a very low non-performing loans ratio, so those are people that don't pay back. Much less than in standard banking. That's funny. Are these social networks better in screening than banks are? Better in dealing with risk? The suggestion is that this is all about peer networks. You can't hide. This is like Facebook. You are going to be named and shamed if you don't pay back your loan. People hate that. Whereas if you default on a bank loan, no, it's the bank. No one really cares. The bank is not going to publish you by name. They can't. In fact, the bank is prohibited to do that, to name and shame you. So that's an important thing. And the CEO of SOPA actually has got an interesting opinion about that as well. Australia does this too. Lending Hub is our peer-to-peer bank, but there are ever more. They pop up everywhere. And I think I found one in Indonesia as well. There you go. Fortunately, I had a translation, so this is an investment that matters. This is providing you with student loans, small student loans. It is actually peer-to-peer banking. It is maybe not quite at the internet side, but it's pretty close to the example of social banking that I was referring to. So it's appearing everywhere. But there's the bad press. Just as with microfinance, all good things come to an end and attract bad press. So here there's a suggestion that Prosper, this US-based social banking experiment, is actually giving very poor returns to the investors. So that seems to be the major problem here with social banking, that they're not doing the right thing for their investors. They're attracting first their relatives, but then it's their relatives, like it's a pyramid scheme. It's building on itself, and these people are not actually making any money out of the process. So what are the problems? Well, here's a problem. You don't have to be a finance graduate to start this social banking experiment. Anyone can do it, even rocket scientists. That's the problem. They lack what we would call the financial knowledge. So if the moderator don't know what they're doing, then we do have a bit of a problem. Screening that happens, so what do these moderators actually do? Well, they take all the information from the student who wants the loan and put that in what they call a credit rating. So they operate a little bit like Moody's or Standard & Poor's, become a rating agency. They provide that rating to the investors, and that's what the investors respond to. But that means they better need to have good skills in coming up with credible credit ratings. And we know how difficult that is. So other problems, lack of minimum standards. This is very much an unregulated area. Regulators struggle to accept whether these are actually banks or whether they are like either. And information agency problems. The investors know a lot less about the loans they are providing, the borrowers they are providing these loans to, than the moderator does. And the moderator, unfortunately, has got their own incentives. Good, that's the second example. Third example, even quicker, low-dot lending. Low-dot lending just means that rather than have to go through an excruciating process where you provide all your financial information to the bank then checks out how likely it is that you repay your loan. By checking your salary statements and whatnot, low-dot lending says that we bypass all that. You can get a quick loan if you just tell us that you will be likely to repay the loan. A little low-dot loan. So there's good things, and that's why I included it here. There are actually positive ethical connotations involved here, just as with P2P banking and microfinance. It makes it much more feasible for people who lack long-term fixed employment to buy a house, to start a little business. So those are good things that are also beneficial to the economy, that lead to economic growth and to prosperity. What's the big innovation here? Well, the big innovation is the last dot point. It is securitization. So what banks do is say that we know relatively little about these borrowers. So what do? We package all the loans, we pool them, and then we split it up into risk components. We call that trenching. That's very difficult process, in fact, so difficult that again, investors fail to really grasp all the practicalities. Hence, there is an information asymmetry problem here. Advertisements by home loan providers. We give you a loan overnight. It's all good. The guy is smiling. Everyone is happy. Maybe not so good if you put it in this context. Just from Google. Where do you find the low doc loans? Right between the Aussie bad credits. Right? That's not so good. Right? You don't want to be in that company. Make no mistake, low doc loans are risky. Although, this exaggerates it a bit. Non-performing loans is about 0.5% on full documentation. So you have to jump a fairly high hurdle before you get a loan. Low doc, the failure rate is a little bit higher, 2%. So yes, there's a price to pay for less information. So what are the problems here for this third case study? The securitization is really complicated, making it really hard for investors to understand what they're buying, what they're investing in. It turns out, I mentioned uncorrelated risks at the beginning. It turns out that these risks weren't all that uncorrelated at all. The people that are likely to default were all defaulting at the same time. And that's a really bad message for investors. The breakdown of self-verification. Increasingly, people that were applying for these loans were what I call at-first selecting. People that had something to hide. People that already knew they were less likely to repay the loans. So an at-first selection problem. Lack of regulation, lack of minimum standards, all of the problems that have been highlighted in the press over the last few years. So I'll skip the one here on low doc boom. There is something worse than low doc, and that's called no doc. No doc means no documentation. We call them in banking also non-conforming loans. This is still the 2% versus 0.5%, full documentation, low documentation. Now, no documentation. That's something different altogether. What that graph tells you is that people are actually quite honest. In the sense that, what's the difference between no doc and low doc? Low doc is what we call self-verified financial information. No doc is no information. Even that much lower level of default on the low docs suggests that people are actually not pushing their luck in getting a loan. They do actually realize themselves what their capacity to repay is. For no doc, you're on your own. Then you have a really big problem as a financial institution. So low doc loans unfortunately fell by the wayside because of all these problems that I highlighted. Rating agencies have usually overreacted by immediately wiping out the whole sector almost overnight. That's a problem as well. Think back about those low doc loans and the self-selection in there. People that are really risky do not actually apply for a low doc loan. So what happened? Rating agencies said to banks, you can no longer provide low doc loans. What that meant was that that 2% failure rate disappeared. But something else disappeared as well. The 98% that was actually able to service those loans. That was able to buy a house, to start a small business. So is that a good ethical solution? Cracking down through regulation? This was not about re-establishing trust and the likelihood of repayment. This was all about eliminating risk altogether. Without risk-taking, there won't be any economic growth or prosperity. So where are we with financial innovation? I think, so this is a wish list perhaps, an ethical wish list. I think that if financial institutions, if you are going to engage in financial innovation, you've got to keep these dot points in mind. Particularly if your financial innovation has an ethical objective, like those 3 examples I've just given you. Do they retain human dignity? Or do they lead to situations like in Andhra Pradesh, where people were suiciding because they were so high in debt? Now that's serious. Disclosure of goals. Is it actually becoming clear to the originators, the founders, if you want, of a microfinance fund, that the funds are now coming from hedge funds, which means that all of a sudden there is a profit imperative rather than an ethical imperative. Vulnerable stakeholders, are you putting enough safeguards in place to protect your family in the peer-to-peer lending example? Privacy and confidentiality, that's all about the loan doc loans. Should we award that privacy without doing all the checking and therefore making it more affordable for people to buy houses and start businesses? Justice, inclusiveness, access, and mostly important, I think, is the last one, is to strike a deal between harm and benefit, the 2% versus the 98% that I mentioned a moment ago. Here's the wish list of leadership. Things that you should be considering, that you should be talking about with your future employers. A rethink of financial regulation. Rather than just cracking down on a particular business activity, because it does have a higher failure rate, recognize why there is that higher failure rate, and then come up with solutions for regulation that preserve the objective to provide loans to people who desperately need them, to start a business, to buy a house, to get out of poverty. And in Australia, they've just introduced what we call a banking and finance oath, like the Hippocratic oath. I think that's nice, it feels good, but I don't think that's the answer. I think what would be much more needed in the finance profession is something like an accounting accreditation body. A finance practicing accreditation would be something which would be sorely needed. What never ceases to amaze me is that the more surveillance we do, the more our world becomes technological, internet-driven, the harder it seems to become to catch unscrupulous operators. Isn't that strange? There goes it again. So that's the limits to technology. Isn't that striking you that it should become easier to prevent unscrupulous traders to enter the market again? Doesn't seem to be the case. The same people keep coming back again and again and again, and misbehave again and again and again. So that is really, I think, a bad news story for technology. And I think what regulators should do is think about how to address that, how they can better use technology to, in fact, weed out those bad operators in the market. Embed ethics in the business plan. Most importantly, and I think what was lacking in the microfinance institutions and also in the P2P lending operations, there is just an assumption that they will behave ethically because the objective of the financial intermediation is ethical. But surely, if you want to make sure that that happens, you've got to embed it in the whole business plan, in business practices in the institutions, rather than just have some statement on your website and saying we do the right thing by poor people. That's not really giving you trust that that will then ultimately happen. I think I'm going to make it now in the last iteration. I did actually find an example here of, one of the things, yes, so one dot point I missed on the previous slide is that regulators seem to believe in this notion of financial literacy. If only we shout loud enough to the public, often enough, then we can make them become financially savvy. I think that's a mistake. I think it is a mistake to think that you can educate everyone to understand the time value of money, for example. It seems like an easy concept for you, but not for the 239,990,000 other Indonesians, right? Seriously, whether that's in Australia, whether that's in Indonesia, whether that's in the UK, it is incredibly difficult to make people aware of the pitfalls of financing, of dealing with financial intermediaries. So I think what needs to happen is a rethink of that whole financial education. So I don't want to rain on the parade of Bank Indonesia that does believe that it can be done. I think in Australia we like to think the same thing, but that's probably not good enough. We need regulation in place that controls these new initiatives, that is on the front foot, for example, in financial regulation of these new innovations. No one seems to be thinking about whether it is legal to operate as a P2P banker or not. It just happens, and there's nothing stopping it. So that's important. A rethink of financial literacy. So let me conclude. I'm sometimes baffled that, me being a finance professor, that we're so popular as a discipline for students. In light of this consistently poor reputation, do you really want to join the ranks of people that are not regarded very highly by society? I don't think it is quite that bad. I think what you see in those diagrams is partly media interest. They like to stir it up a little bit. I don't really believe that our finance profession is attracting bad apples. I think they're no worse than any other profession. There's plenty of unethical behavior in the health profession. So I think that even those people that work for Lehman Brothers, they're not unethical operators. They worked for a boss, they did certain things. Maybe they weren't always thinking through the consequences of some of the decisions they would take. That is probably a much more educational imperative than trying to educate the ultimate retail consumers. It's also interesting that there is actually a lot of interest in doing the right thing, social responsibility, both internal to the institutions and external. The pity is that external stakeholders don't really believe the financial operators, that they are doing that with the right incentives. It seems that the formal, traditional banking is converging with informal banking channels, like you see in microfinance. You could wonder whether the ethics of these two channels are also coinciding. And lastly, I think I still like to believe that financial innovator is the lifeblood of progress, of economic progress. So I like to go with the people that were defending the motion that it is really important that we have financial innovators, and hence that you be educated as well as you possibly can, as long as you keep some of these ethical messages in mind. That's it.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's been 5 minutes over an hour. That's all right. I think we get a lot of knowledge, very useful for us. Yeah, we want to be finance profession. So from Professor Kofman lecture, we get several new terms. I think that we have social banking or low block banking. Yeah. Me as a profession, as a finance educator and also professional, find this terms new, as you know, because we are used to like credit above-brand operator loan or credit card loan, but here we have new terms and new innovation. And I also take note of the last sentences by our professor that financial innovation is necessary. Is that if there is no risk-taking, there is no economic growth and there is no prosperity. And that finance needs an accreditation body such as in accounting. Okay, now I think I'll give session for questions. Let's give three question first for the first session, and if we still have time, then there will be second session with three questions as well. Okay. Mention your name. Yeah.
My name is Harry.
2, 0, 1, 3. Okay. Start for you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Harry Samputra. I was graduate from Faculty of Law, University of Indonesia. I'm law practitioner. I finished my high school in Cairns, Australia. In my point of view, financial literacy at least has to have people that have capacity, competency, capabilities, sort of like that, and have good process, system, formational, and everything that is part of the process. And my emphasis is value. Values is not just value of economic or something business, but values that universal, values about humanity. Because if you don't talk about values as a whole, as a system that integrated in financial sector, I think the problem like now is, the lack of credibility or something like that still happen. In my experience, I manage a foundation. It's quasi business because now everything is quasi, you know. Something sometimes social, sometimes business. I have a dream that every entities have endowment fund, but budgeting, not just even the government have endowment fund. Endowment fund means you don't have to have recycle or reuse the money like investment, but you have endowment that still have, because in universe it's endowment entities. Our Earth is endowment.
The questions directly.
Yeah, and I want to have my views about endowment entities in finance, because endowment, we strive hard to not have the endowment go down. I mean, even in the company, even in the social, in foreign, not just investment all the time. I mean, recycle and reuse. But because our universe is enough, our universe, our Earth is fulfill all our needs without greed and something that not divine, something like that.
Okay, so this question about
yeah, I have what endowment entities in finance.
Yep. So I beg to disagree a little, given that we are keenly aware of endowment as a university. Universities, in our view, universities should be fully endowed as well, like Yale, like Harvard, etc. Very few universities outside the US actually are. They depend on recurrent funding. And in some cases, universities are actually borrowing, just like financial institutions are doing, to leverage up their operations. Now, is that per se bad? I would very much subscribe to a fully endowed enterprise, but that is simply not feasible. So for the same token, if I think about microfinance, I would love it if NGOs could be solely responsible for providing microfinance. But you would get nowhere close to the reach that you've seen on those pictures that I showed you, the diagram. The sheer reach of these microfinance institutions once they started expanding their investment base. So I don't disagree with you, but I think it imposes limits on the system, and I think that the limits, in a sense, are unfair for a large proportion of the population that then cannot have access to those funds. So it's a matter of
how the business entities have endowment, not just the social.
But the question is, where do these endowments come from? That's the question. The endowment is not made from heaven.
Togetherness, right? Not togetherness and something like cooperative, something like that.
Yeah, I think in finance we have the term very popular organization of freelancers. So it's very difficult to get the funds for endowment. I think in the United States, some universities, but we are now in the highly reputable ones can get endowment, but not the.
But most of the NGOs, if you think about one popular one that you know here again, Médecins Sans Frontières, they can't operate by an endowment. They would be out of business in no time, because if you think about the donations that were given to them in terms of an endowment, they would be able to operate in a single country perhaps. Now they're operating in something like 50 or 60 countries where they're much needed. They can only do that by actually borrowing and by actually continuing the donations as operational funds rather than as endowments. I would very much like you, I would like to see that change, and gradually it might. But at present, I don't think there's much scope to do the same scale of operation with only endowments.
Yeah, the difficulty is to get the funds.
Even in national scale, the people really are related from the business society and the social society together and sort of make it like a breakthrough, make like sort of like endowment, national endowment fund, something like that. Why? Because
okay, I think we can continue to the second. Let's have the question first.
Sure.
Okay, good afternoon, sir. My name is Muhammad Fadel. I'm a lecturer assistant from the Finance Department, University of Indonesia. I'm interested with your explanation about financial innovation. So I'd like to know to what extent that financial innovation can be said as ethical or non-ethical, and how can we make this financial innovation to be more ethical? I mean, in the United States, if we're going back in 2002 or 2006, where the securitization is coming up, it's upsurging in America, and everyone happy because of its high return, and everyone happy with the investment bank. But when the investment is going down, I mean, the CDOs or CMOs is going down at the time, and everyone blames financial innovation. So can we talk that as kind of an ethical things in financial innovation, and how can we make it more ethical in terms of this financial innovation that is made by like investment bank or the commercial banks?
Next question.
Okay. Next, Gapi Lusinaga, the accounting student here. I want to ask a question about the relations between the financial innovations and the investment banks. Are the financial innovations really necessary to the investment banks? Because following the LIBOR scandal, you know, the LIBOR scandal, people start to lose their faith to investment banks more and more. Can financial innovations boost their power, or making them in the worst situations? I think what financial innovations can do to the investment banks.
I think it's clear about the use of power of investment banks to do the great financial innovation. They are very important for society.
So what was the first question? Sorry if you hear the two that I forget the first one. So briefly, what was
so to what extent financial innovation can be said as ethical or ethical?
So let's start at the beginning. I think if you happen to be a financial engineer, right? You're really good in your quant skills. You may find a position with an investment bank where they will utilize those skills. I think it is entirely unfair to blame those financial engineers for the ethical repercussions of what they are asked to do, right? So I think first and foremost, and that's why this talk is titled Leadership, is that it has to be the senior ranks that need to understand what they're doing. So what has been happening, I'm kind of answering both of your questions at the same time. Think about Australia. Australia is very proud of its banking system. There are 4 big banks. They basically carve up the market for financial services. Sure, there's investment banks and there's a whole lot of other stuff that's going on, but they're all minor players. Mostly because Australia is what they call a 4 pillars policy. Essentially, that is providing an oligopoly to those 4 financial institutions. What do you think the upshot of that is in terms of financial innovation? If you create a monopoly or an oligopoly, there is no incentive whatsoever to financially innovate. So they don't. Australian banks are not so bad mousing here, ANZ and CBA and Westpac. So seriously, they invest very little in financial innovation. At best, they piggyback on something like P2P banking when it suits them. But they are not proactive in this. Who pays the price for that? Yes, we pay very much the price for that in terms of rather steep fees that they can keep charging on simple transactions like withdrawing money from televisions. So you've got to keep in mind that these organizations have got shareholders. The shareholders want a certain return on their investment, and there's different ways in getting those returns. The investment banks, on the other hand, there are investment banks operating in Australia. They're not allowed to do basic retail banking services, right? So they provide other services. They can operate in the funds management space. They can operate in corporate banking. That's what they do. It is a very crowded space. There are lots of people competing there for that space, which means that, as that example that I had in the slide, the margins get squeezed to the barest minimum. So what that means is that they got to think about volume again, or it's about opening up a new fee for a particular new service. and then everyone follows and it gets squeezed again. We call that perfect competition, right? So this is every time when innovation opens a new opportunity, reduces cost, then it takes some time before new entrants come and squeeze it straight back down again. And we have to start from scratch. So creative destruction, I think, is the word that we use in finance and in economics. Where's the imperative for ethics? Where's the imperative to make sure that innovations are actually contributing something to society? Unfortunately, I think the market actually, so I totally subscribe to the market as a good instrument to get fairness and equity. It fails very quickly. But I do actually think that the market does sort things out rather dramatically, as you've seen with Lehman Brothers, for example. So the market does sort out the bad innovations, like securitization, the excesses of securitization, and the things that really work, like ATMs as an innovation, right? Which is generally good for the public at large. It has seriously reduced the cost of transacting, of doing banking transactions. So in that sense, the unfortunate thing is that the sorting out process in showing that securitization was all bad is very painful for a lot of investors, mostly. They lose all their money because all the shareholders in Lehman Brothers lost all their money. Not so much the people who were borrowing money. All they found was that it then became a bit harder to refinance their loans at higher interest rates. But those are kind of like the adjustments that happen in the marketplace, sorting out good innovations from bad innovations. Maybe financial leaders, so senior management in those financial institutions, need to give that a bit more thought beforehand, or maybe accepting more liability for the consequences of Lehman Brothers going bankrupt, for example. And there's some of that going on. I think nowadays, unfortunately for them, directors on boards actually go to jail sometimes if they do the wrong thing. Right? So from a legal perspective, I think there are now more severe penalties for things that weren't properly thought through in terms of their consequences. I hope I've addressed both of your questions.
Yeah, we are running out of time, so I think we still have only for one or two questions. Okay, I think one. Okay, that's three, but let's have only one.
Very quick ones.
Yeah, quick ones. Yeah. Or one.
Have you seen the film Inside the Job?
Of course, finance people all love them.
So what do you think about financial innovation and about the reputation of Wall Street and everything? And the second one is about I'm an advisor board of the microfinance in Indonesia. This is running like it's the total 95,000 women. Now we are being very sexy in terms of financial actors from Europe. A lot of overcome them to be used as a loan because they said that it's very, it's going to be very profitable if we invest in microfinance because there's a crisis in the Europe and they have a lot of poverty because we do like the social responsibility while they are doing
I forget, so I better give you a quick answer. I think all those movies about what's going on Wall Street are gross exaggerations of what really happens at Wall Street. I think surely there are bad people who just do, I'm getting as rich as I possibly can get. Everyone can say that. But most people do actually have a conscience, so tend to be a little bit more positive about human nature. And they actually just do a job. Like many other people, the person who's doing the plumbing in the Wall Street apartments is as conscientious about their job as the person who is doing the banking. So I think that these movies are just there for us to gloat over and think, oh, this is really fun. It is, unfortunately, finance, sorry Doug, but unfortunately finance is really quite boring most of the time. Very repetitive in terms of the nature of the deals. It's not that, we use the word sexy, it's not that sexy most of the time. I think you're onto something very important there in terms of some of the examples I gave, like SKS, they're on the wrong track. I think there's a different group of microfinance institutions which should be more supported by governments, more supported by regulators, and the regulators should focus more on saying that this is just not acceptable to operate in that space because it is making your life harder in actually doing the right thing in terms of CSR, in actually educating the people that you give the loans to at the same time. But that's a difficult process, right? Because it directly impinges on the reach that you can possibly get. So,
financial innovations, how do you think the public perception about that
well, that's the thing, I think, and that's back to the movies. I think that's the bad thing. I think what people want to hear is juicy stories of people misbehaving, doing the wrong thing. It's always very frustrating that if you've got good news stories, like a documentary about microfinance, then that's banished to, we've got the ABC channel, I don't know if you know that, hardly anyone watches that because it's not a commercial channel, so everyone watches the commercial channel. That's a big problem, because that kind of exposure of something like microfinance for that reason doesn't actually get to the large population at large. And my parents know nothing about microfinance, for example. So I think there's really something that maybe we as educators should be doing more in telling people that there are actually very important aspects in addition to economic growth that you get. Most people don't get the simple fact that they can walk to the corner shop and buy groceries only because there is financial intermediation. Without that grocery shop on the corner actually being able to prepay for their merchandise, there wouldn't be anything on the shelves. So those kind of simple concepts could change people's perception of our profession, hopefully for the better. And that was properly in place with regulators that know what they're doing. One of the discussions we had earlier yesterday at the meeting was that the biggest problem for financial regulators is that they struggle to recruit smart people. That would be you. And that is because they don't pay nearly as much as investment banks and financial consultants, the big four accounting consultancy firms, for example. Seriously, that is a real problem, because that means that the people working for these financial regulators are immediately at a disadvantage in understanding some of the financial innovation that is cooked up in those investment banks. We need to be on the same page when we are assessing the risks involved in those new financial innovations. If the regulators can't understand it, then we have a problem. So I think there's a real role for the government to change that, maybe to be more competitive in their salary offerings.
Okay, that's all, and let's give a big hand to all of them. So, okay, thank you very much for the attendance, and so we'll meet again in the next lecture. custodians will get the certificates 2 days from now, and you can go to the Umas. Umas.
But you're also directly involved.
Yeah, now Indonesia is currently trying to have like microfinance already.
So they try to legislate this.
But they have been working since the end of this month. They can use it for
Yang belum absen buat bikin sertifikat ya.
Absen yang tadi pagi?
Iya, yang absen tadi pagi. Itu buat sertifikat. Yang belum absen ini apa? Ejaan nama. Nah, ntar khawatirnya salah sertifikatnya lain namanya.
Is there a representative agent for microfinance institutions?
Yes, actually we have the line fee
Tolong bawa ini. Hah? Yang dibawa. Angkat sendiri. Kan? Akan pulas doang. Pulas doang. Potong bodi. Ya dua kan dari student center ke sini.
You can say that, and then you've created enough of a buffer to make that. Right.
We go very fast. Now we are in the process of trying to slow down.
Huh?
Yeah, that's always scary, right? Because then usually government structures right, the risk management scheme and stuff.
We are keep up with our
Because hopefully we are holding our open house end of February. What's it? So we can so we have to divide this.
I didn't mean that we find
I share your desire, but I'm also considering that people want to put their money with their insurance.
yeah, but my point is sort of like status for endowment fund that never going life. Everyone starts to the money can be used.
So I like in the alumni relations. My understanding I think there.
Bawa aja minum. Apa? Minumnya mau bawa.
Oh yang ini.
Ya.
For one share. Can I only get one professor for $500? And then we explain it, yes, because the endowment will be sustainable.